Chapter 4. The First Passover. The Original Covenant. It's a little old, too. Now that we understand why there is such obscurity and diversity in church doctrine, or is it still too obscure, we must go back to the story in the Bible where this tradition finds its origins, not as a man-made invention, but as a command from the very words of God given to his chosen people, the Israelites. As Christians, followers and students of Christ, we must always be both aware of and sensitive to our roots as adopted Jews. Jesus was Jewish, as were all the apostles, and the great majority of disciples in Jerusalem, in Israel no less, following Jesus' resurrection. This important fact has been obscured over church history, so much so that 30 to 35% of today's Christians believe that the Christian church has fulfilled or replaced the nation of Israel in God's plan, according to a Lifeway research study in 2018. But the Apostle Paul, himself a Jew, saw it quite differently. He anguished over his fellow non-believing Jews. Throughout his letter to Romans, the church in Rome was a non-Jewish church, in chapters 9 through 11, he says it this way.
I ask then, did God reject his people? By no means. I am an Israelite myself, a descendant of Abraham, from the tribe of Benjamin. God did not reject his people, whom he foreknew. Again I ask, did they stumble so as to fall beyond recovery? Not at all. Rather, because of their transgression, salvation has come to the Gentiles to make Israel envious. But if their transgression means riches for the world, and their loss means riches for the Gentiles, how much greater riches will their full inclusion bring? If some of the branches have been broken off, and you, though a wild olive shoot, have been grafted in among the others, and now share in the nourishing sap from the olive root, do not consider yourself to be superior to those other branches. If you do, consider this. You do not support the root, but the root supports you. You will say then, branches were broken off so that I could be grafted in. Granted, but they were broken off because of unbelief, and you stand by faith. Do not be arrogant, but tremble. For if God did not spare the natural branches, he will not spare you either. Consider therefore the kindness and sternness of God, sternness to those who fell, but kindness to you, provided that you continue in his kindness. Otherwise, you also will be cut off. And if they do not persist in unbelief, they will be grafted in, for God is able to graft them in again. After all, if you were cut out of an olive tree that is wild by nature, and contrary to nature were grafted into a cultivated olive tree, how much more readily will these, the natural branches, be grafted into their own olive tree? I do not want you to be ignorant of this mystery, brothers and sisters, so that you may not be conceited. Israel has experienced a hardening, in part, until the full number of the Gentiles has come in, and in this way all Israel will be saved. Romans 11, verses 1-2, 11 and 12, and 17 through 26.
So as we look through the lens of Jewish history, told to us in part by the Old Testament scriptures, we must recognize that it was through this very lens that Jesus spoke to those who listened. When he used examples from Jewish history, and when he made references to and quoted Jewish scripture, aka the Bible, it was in the very context of the Jewish culture, practice, and beliefs that his audience grew up and was immersed in. And while the Apostle Paul understood and taught why it was important to love and respect non-believing Jews, he also drove home the point that everyone who believes in God by faith is adopted equally into God's family.
They are the people of Israel, chosen to be God's adopted children. God revealed his glory to them. He made covenants with them and gave them his law. He gave them the privilege of worshiping him and receiving his wonderful promises. Romans 9:4. So you have not received a spirit that makes you fearful slaves. Instead, you received God's Spirit when he adopted you as his own children. Now we call him Abba, Father. Romans 8:15. But when the set time had fully come, God sent his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those under the law, that we might receive adoption to sonship. Galatians 4:4 and 5. That's why the inheritance comes through faith, so that it will be on the basis of God's grace. In that way, the promise is secure for all of Abraham's descendants, not just for those who are related by law, but also for those who are related by the faith of Abraham, who is the father of all of us. Romans 4:16. For he chose us in him before the creation of the world to be holy and blameless in his sight. In love he predestined us for adoption to sonship through Jesus Christ, in accordance with his pleasure and will, to the praise of his glorious grace, which he has freely given us in the one he loves. Ephesians 1, 4-6.
Preparing the table. This all makes what we find in the book of Exodus most compelling, because so much of what's happened in history up to that point was just the prelude to what God had planned next. Up through the story of Joseph, and his technicolor dreamcoat, and his brothers, the 12 sons of Israel, or Jacob, and how Joseph became ruler in Egypt second only to Pharaoh, the book of Genesis ends in Joseph's death. God's story continues in the book of Exodus by explaining how the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly, increased in numbers, and became so numerous that the land was filled with them. Exodus 1:7. The growth of the Israelite population would have increased significantly over the 70 years leading up to Joseph's death. Over the subsequent 65 years until Moses was born, the Israelite population would have multiplied even more. At some point during this period, between Joseph and Moses, a new king came to power after the memory of Joseph and all he had done for the nation of Egypt had faded, deciding to enslave and oppress the Israelites to keep them at bay.
Then a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. "Look," he said to his people, "the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous, and if war breaks out, will join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country." Exodus 1, 8-10.
Up until Moses was 80 years old, the Israelites lived as slaves at the hands of the Egyptians. But the slavery was unique, as they were slaves as a people to a people. They lived in their own communities on the outskirts of the places they were forced to work, serving in a variety of capacities throughout the fertile land of Goshen, Genesis 47:21, along the Nile, near the Delta. Ultimately, from the time of God's initial promise to Abraham in Genesis, chapter 12, verses 1-4, until the physical exodus of the Israelites from Egypt, strangers in a country not their own, Genesis 15:13, a total of 430 years had passed. The year is 1446 BC, give or take a couple of weeks, with Moses already an old man of 80, though still young at heart, having been called by God to lead his own people, the Israelites, out of slavery and into the promised land of Canaan, the very land in which their forefather Abraham and his wife Sarah had bore their children so many years ago. Let's pick up the story from here then, shall we? Let my people go. Reading through the story of Moses in the book of Exodus, and the first 9 plagues God sent upon the Egyptians to prepare them for the release of the Jewish nation, the plague of blood, the plague of frogs, the plague of gnats, the plague of flies, the plague on livestock, the plague of boils, the plague of hail, the plague of locusts, the plague of darkness, we arrive at the 10th plague, in Exodus 11, by which God curses the nation of Egypt with that which finally compels Pharaoh, the Egyptian king, to release the Israelites from slavery and send them out of the country. The plague on the firstborn. God tells Moses to communicate to Pharaoh the coming of that final plague, after which
"Pharaoh will let you go from here, and when he does, he will drive you out completely." Exodus 11:1.
So Moses takes the word of God to Pharaoh and relays God's message.
So Moses said to Pharaoh, "This is what the Lord says. About midnight I will go throughout Egypt. Every firstborn son in Egypt will die, from the firstborn son of Pharaoh, who sits on the throne, to the firstborn son of the female slave, who is at her handmill, and all the firstborn of the cattle as well. There will be loud wailing throughout Egypt, worse than there has ever been or ever will be again. But among the Israelites not a dog will bark at any person or animal. Then you will know that the Lord makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel. All these officials of yours will come to me, bowing down before me and saying, 'Go, you and all the people who follow you.' After that, I will leave." Then Moses, hot with anger, left Pharaoh. Exodus 11, 4-8.
Now while God prepares to send the angel of death to kill every firstborn throughout the whole nation of Egypt, instructions are given to the Israelites to perform a task of obedience, in faith, that will protect their own households from the same curse. It's important to note here that God could certainly have excluded the Israelites' households from the coming plague, while they just sat idly by, lazing around watching TV and playing solitaire. But instead, God requires his people to perform an act of obedience, to demonstrate their faith that he would do as he promised. And not just a one-time act, but setting into motion a lasting ordinance, a lifelong practice of remembrance and celebration. On the evening the plague was to come, each Jewish household was to slaughter a 1-year-old male lamb or goat, one without blemish or defect, spreading his blood over their home's doorposts, the uprights, and lintel, not the beam, the wooden crossbeam, roasting the meat, and consuming the animal completely, or burning up any that remained, eating it with bread that was made without yeast, or leaven. The bread was to be unleavened because they were going to be skipping town, and they would neither have the time to let the bread rise, nor would it keep for their journey. Additionally, the cooked animal should be shared and eaten not only with the entire household, which may have included several families, but with other Israelites who did not have the stock to draw from, or when a family wasn't large enough to consume an entire animal by themselves. God continues at verse 12.
On that same night I will pass through Egypt, and strike down every firstborn of both people and animals, and I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord. The blood will be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you. No destructive plague will touch you when I strike Egypt. Take a bunch of hyssop, dip it into the blood in the basin, and put some of the blood on the top and both sides of the doorframe. None of you shall go out of the door of your house until morning. When the Lord goes through the land to strike down the Egyptians, he will see the blood on the top and sides of the doorframe, and will pass over that doorway, and he will not permit the destroyer to enter your house and strike you down. Exodus 12:12 and 13, and 22:23.
And so the Israelites did as they were commanded. And that evening, which is the beginning of the Jewish day, the angel of God came through every household and put to death every firstborn, both man and animal, throughout all of Egypt, except the Israelite households and livestock. And there was a great wailing throughout all that nation. Now, with Pharaoh's own firstborn son dead, and in great despair, he calls Moses up to his court and commands that he and all the Israelites be expelled immediately from the land. So it was that the Israelites grabbed all their stuff, they were already packed because they believed what God had promised, and headed off together toward the Red Sea. There were a couple million men, women, and children, in addition to all the livestock they owned, plus all the possessions the Egyptian commoners gifted to their Israelite neighbors on the way out.
Tell all the Israelite men and women to ask their Egyptian neighbors for articles of silver and gold. Now the Lord had caused the Egyptians to look favorably on the people of Israel, and Moses was considered a very great man in the land of Egypt, respected by Pharaoh's officials and the Egyptian people alike. Exodus 11:2 and 3. The Israelites did as Moses instructed, and asked the Egyptians for articles of silver and gold and for clothing. The Lord had made the Egyptians favorably disposed toward the people, and they gave them what they asked for. So they plundered the Egyptians. Exodus 12:35 and 36.
And so it happened, just as the Lord had said. Just passing over. Now the Israelites were commanded to remember this historic occasion every year by way of celebration. God told them what to eat, how to prepare it, and even how to eat it. As we read next, God establishes the new Israelite calendar to start with the month of Aviv, later adopting the Babylonian name Nisan, with the 14th day of the month set as the day of Passover, or Pesach in Hebrew. Let's read Exodus 12:1 through 11, where we can see these things set into motion.
This month is to be for you the first month of your year. Tell the whole community of Israel that on the 10th day of this month, each man is to take a lamb for his family. Take care of them until the 14th day of the month, when all the members of the community of Israel must slaughter them at twilight. Then they are to take some of the blood and put it on the sides and tops of the door frames of the houses where they eat the lambs. That same night, they are to eat the meat roasted over the fire, along with bitter herbs, and bread made without yeast. Do not eat the meat raw or boiled in water, but roasted over a fire, with the head, legs, and internal organs. Do not leave any of it till morning. If some is left till morning, you must burn it. This is how you are to eat it, with your cloak tucked into your belt, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. Eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover.
As our discussion continues, let us note that the Jewish day, in fact, begins in the evening. The days are counted from dusk till dusk. Sounds like the title of a bad Quentin Tarantino movie. And so the 14th of the month of Aviv begins at dusk on the evening of the 13th, as we Gentiles would understand it. New beginnings. The Passover marks the beginning of a new life, free from slavery and captivity. No longer just sons of Jacob, the Israelites were given new lives and new identities as children of God. Sacrificial requirements. Lamb Selection Day. The sacrifice, or lamb, was to be selected on the 10th of Aviv by each family or household. Families were to determine how they would combine to share the lamb, and to, therefore, determine how many lambs that household would need to set aside or select. This first time, Families would draw from their own flocks, if lambs, or herds, goats, and select which animals would be used for the sacrifice. Once the temple was built 500 years later, this was nearly impossible to honor since those living in the city were not farmers and owned no livestock. They ultimately would be required to purchase their lamb for this purpose, or any other sacrifice. Slaughter together at twilight. Each sacrifice was to be put to death at twilight of the 14th day by the head of that household, and consumed before morning. They were to roast the meat on an open fire, because this was the fastest way to cook it. Boiling it took too long, and they weren't to eat of it rare or uncooked as the Egyptians often did. Because this was all to be done in haste, they were to remain in their homes until they were done eating. They weren't to take any of it outside during the meal. If the lambs had been sacrificed en masse as a community event, then people would have been sitting around waiting for theirs to be distributed and served. By limiting each to their own household, all of Israel could conform to the timing of cooking, consumption, and disposal, allowing them to be prepared to leave later that next morning. Not to remain until morning. No leftovers were allowed, and any part of it not consumed was to be burned. Burning was the proper way of disposing anything discarded, except human remains. All animal carcasses and other refuse was treated as such and burned. Because nothing in the ancient world was manufactured, there was no pollution created from burning stuff. Everything used in those days was carbon-based, so there was no knowledge or concern of any environmental impact. Without blemish or defect. The selected sacrifice must be a year-old male without blemish or defect. This indicated that there was indeed a norm for each living creature. Not only did mankind identify such blemishes, but God did too. There was how life was supposed to be, and then there was that corrupted version that was opposed to be. The corruption is a byproduct of the fall, an expulsion from Eden. So mankind learned that some animals were better for breeding and producing food and offspring. Livestock had monetary value, and so the most correct animals fetched the highest price. And so it was these very animals that God expected to be sacrificed to him, in order that each family felt the cost associated with their freedom. And the reason the animal was to be only a year old was so that it would not have yet borne offspring. No broken bones. Because the Israelites were slaves, they were inherently poor. So whenever they had opportunity to eat meat, they would break the animal's bones, it was a lot easier after it was cooked, and extract the marrow for additional flavor and nutrients. But because they were to eat the Passover in haste, God didn't want them to waste their time with the bones. Also, because God promised to care for and protect them, they were no longer to consider themselves poor, and sucking the marrow was a poor people thing to do. Only the Jews. Non-Israelites and uncircumcised folks were excluded from participating in the Feast of the Passover Lamb because the occasion was one of reaffirming God's covenant with the Israelites. Many of the Israelites, during their time in Egypt, didn't practice circumcision. Because they believed they had been abandoned by God, that covenant they'd heard about was bust. But God demanded that only the circumcised may eat of it, and so God expected all men to undergo circumcision as needed to comply. This may also be why they were given several days' notice of what was coming so that the men could comply and heal before it was time to leave. No bread with yeast or leaven. The unleavened bread commemorated the speed with which the Jews had to leave Egypt, and thus became symbolic of Israelite redemption. More importantly, as we'll discuss later, leaven also represented death and corruption, and consuming it was like saying, "I don't want to live, I'd rather die." Kind of a slap in God's face for what he was offering them. The blood will be a sign. The blood of an animal is its life, and to shed its blood means to kill it. When an animal is sacrificed, it is being used to take the place of the one offering it, so that instead of death coming to the offerer, as will be later demonstrated by various atonement offerings, the animal takes on the guilt and pays the penalty for the offerer. By the spreading of the sacrifice's blood on the uprights and lintels or crossbeams of the doors, God passes over those that dwell inside the place marked and sealed by the blood of the sacrifice. A lasting ordinance. The Passover was to be a lasting ordinance, in memorial of this saving event. It was to be remembered and celebrated regularly in recognition of God's salvation of his people. This tradition is now nearly 3,500 years old and is the oldest living tradition in the world. This is made possible only through God's supernatural and superintentional protection of the Jewish nation over their entire history, despite Israel's sworn enemies' efforts in annihilating them. Though they repeatedly turned from God and failed to keep up their end of the covenant, God never relented on his promise to care for them in the big picture. So then, we see God establishing a lasting ordinance that the Israelites were to observe indefinitely. There would follow many more guidelines and regulations for them to live by, but it is this single event, the Passover, that sets the stage for what's to come.
Now the length of time the Israelite people lived in Egypt was 430 years. At the end of the 430 years, to the very day, all the Lord's divisions left Egypt. Exodus 12:40 and 41.
We'll see how these things connect to our practice of the Lord's Supper later, if you want to.